Welcome back to Coinscrum Markets. I'm Teana Baker-Taylor, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Perianne Boring, founder and president of the Chamber of Digital Commerce. Hey, Perianne, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Teana, it's great to be here.
It's great to have you. So today we're going to dig into the U.S. infrastructure bill. There's been a lot of activity on Capitol Hill over the last month, and it seems like maybe the crypto industry was a little bit taken by surprise by what was added as a pay-for into the U.S. infrastructure bill. We've seen the increase in scrutiny, let's say, from regulators and policymakers around the world over the last year. But this one really was interesting in that it kind of focused on a couple of specific things, especially tax reporting. So it seems like the US and Congress specifically is kind of raising the bar a little bit on tax and reporting requirements and classification of market actors. But crypto is already taxed and reporting requirements already exist. So can you just break this down for us, Perianne, kind of start at the beginning? What is a pay for? How do things like this end up in bills? And what exactly was included in this bill and why is it important? And maybe even more importantly, what isn't included in this bill?
Yeah, and this really, it should not have been a surprise. There were many indicators throughout the year that this was coming. And the first one was in April, the IRS commissioner testified in Senate Finance, and he stated publicly that information reporting for digital assets was going to be a priority. And then Senator Portman, who's on that committee, responded saying, I'm working on legislation that does just that. And then then he did an interview on CNBC. So this was widely documented in the press that these efforts were underway. And then in May, Treasury published their Green Book, which outlined their priorities. And that also included information reporting for cryptocurrencies. So then there was a third indicator that this is a priority and this is coming. What was a little bit of a surprise is that this was included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill as a pay for. This process is something we do not agree with at the chamber. This is not how you do smart public policy making, because the infrastructure bill has absolutely nothing to do with crypto tax policy. Right. The infrastructure bill is funding all sorts of infrastructure projects across the United States. And really kind of the important thing to understand about this piece of legislation is that it has huge political pressure behind it of incredible magnitude, all the way up to President Biden himself. This is a huge promise for him. It's incredibly important to the president that this bill becomes passed into law. And he has put a lot of pressure on Democrats in Congress, both on the Senate side and the House side, to get this done. And so it's being done in a very expedited way. And there's a lot of constraints that are included in this. So the information reporting requirements for digital assets, it's about 4 pages of the entire bill. And this bill is thousands of pages long. It is quite an effort. As a former congressional staffer, anytime you see a piece of legislation that's that big, I'm always just kind of skeptical from the beginning, because there's so many things that really need to be discussed and debated. And once it gets to a certain length, it's really hard to be able to scrutinize everything. But these 4 pages related to information reporting have been highly and heavily debated and reviewed by top industry and legal experts across the crypto tax space. So it's scored. So the Joint Committee on Taxation, they scored this provision, and and that means they're estimating kind of the revenue that would generate for IRS once this is implemented to be $28 billion, I think over a 10-year timeline. Don't quote me on the timeline, but I think it's $28 billion over 10 years. So it's not just any pay for, it is one of the largest pay fors of the entire bill. And that's also something that's important to understand, is that when Congress is passing a piece of legislation that increases spending on any level, they want to pay for it in that bill as well. And that's something that the group of senators that came together to build this legislation, that was something that they promised they would do. So they're using this as a pay for. We've met with all of the offices that have been a part of drafting this. So we've spent a lot of time trying to understand exactly what their goals are and what they're trying to accomplish. One of the things that I will say that we're disappointed to hear and have really pushed back on is just the premise as to why this is needed. So multiple Senate offices have said that this is about closing the tax gap. So what they're saying when they're saying, hey, we got to close the tax gap, we need this new legislation to do this, essentially they're saying that the crypto space is not a law-abiding community, and that people are not paying their taxes and they're out of compliance. And that is not an honest way to approach this. Information reporting is something the industry, many companies across the industry have been asking the IRS for years for guidance to clarify how to do information reporting for digital assets. There are a number of questions that need to be addressed, so companies have, they know how to do this correctly. And IRS really just has not done their job. They have not issued this guidance. They have been criticized for not issuing this guidance. So just to set the record straight, this is not about closing the tax gap, despite what you may have heard. This really is about clarifying the regulatory requirements for brokers. But there's, again, a lot of political things that are going into this because it's a pay for. It's a pretty significant part of the strategy of getting that information reporting bill done. And there's definitely concerns about it. So the biggest concern has been expanding who would be considered a broker in the crypto space. The definitions in this bill are rather broad. Specifically, the definition of a broker is rather broad, and there are many people and companies, including the chamber, who are concerned that that could be interpreted to include entities that clearly are not that clearly are not brokers. Right. Most importantly, miners, node operators, and validators. So we've done a significant amount of work to try to get that clarified. And I can kind of talk through what those efforts look like. But that is the biggest concern, that these requirements are going to be put on entities that clearly are not brokers, but also who do not have access to the information to comply, thus will not be able to comply.
Yeah. Indeed. So, that's, I think, probably the bulk of the concerns that the community seems to have raised, is this characterizing of industry participants as brokers that are performing other types of crypto related activities, but not necessarily transactions. And so software developers are, one of the groups of participants that have been identified as potentially at risk here. Other concerns that have been raised is that, this language and this provision within the bill could, stem future innovation with U.S. companies not wanting to continue to do business in the U.S. or new companies wanting to set up in the U.S. For example, the miner migration that we're, expecting from China. So do you think that what is contained in the bill actually does put the industry at risk for future innovation in the US? Or is this just some miscommunication around exactly what's in that bill being interpreted?
I think it's a little bit of both. There has been quite a bit of confusion about what this bill actually would do, and that's caused really hysteria across the industry. So a couple of things. You mentioned software developers. Also miners and node validators and node operators. So kind of the first thing to understand is that Treasury has a vested interest in this working. If they put forward, and well, actually, once this bill is passed into law, IRS will issue guidance. And in that guidance is where all of the details will be clarified. This is just generally how tax law is done. The statutes are quite broad, and then the guidance fleshes out in a lot of detail, kind of what the specifics are going to look like. So really, there's a much more important process, or an incredibly important part of the process is going to happen once this is passed into law. So again, IRS is not going to write a rule that's not administrable, because that is not in their best interest. If it's broken, if it doesn't work, it's not going to accomplish their said goals. Mm-hmm. So extending these requirements to entities who have no way to comply would not make sense. Again, the definitions are written broadly, so there are concerns that inadvertently non-brokers could be looped in, but there is no indication at this point that that is going to happen. So the drafters of the bill have publicly stated and even issued a colloquy at this point saying it is not Congress's intent to loop in those actors, and they have directed IRS to not include those actors in the guidance once they go to write it. In addition, Treasury and IRS have issued statements already that it is not their intention to loop in those actors. So are the definitions broad? Yes. Could the definitions potentially be included to potentially be interpreted to include those actors? Yes. Is there any indication that would happen? No. In addition, having a non-administrable law and regulations, that isn't going to meet anybody's goals. So we do have concerns, but we are very optimistic about what the future of this is going to look like. And a lot of that has to do with the huge amount of advocacy and education that went around this bill, where a number of people expressed their concerns. And we were very adamant about getting those concerns documented, at least in public statements, their intent.
Yeah, well, and we saw, a number of policymakers kind of rally in the weeks before the House ended up passing, or sorry, the Senate ended up passing the bill back to the House and approving it, to come up with compromise amendments or brand new amendments that would clarify some of these things, and those weren't added to the bill, and now the bill has been passed back to the House. And it seems that the House is likely, as you mentioned, understanding the presidential focus on pushing the infrastructure bill, unlikely to allow any further amendments to the bill in the House. So if that's accurate, what's the next step then? Is it that there is another bill that this could be attached to? If we're just attaching things willy-nilly to bills that have nothing to do with crypto? Or is it really in drilling down into the execution of the legislation within the tax code, where some of this clarity is going to come from?
Yeah, you're kind of going back to kind of what happened on the Senate side. So just kind of to touch on that real quick, there were a number of amendments put forward to address this. And then the kind of two competing amendments, those group of senators came together really in an amazing way and had this compromise amendment that everybody could get behind. But the problem was there was significant constraints on the floor, and that amendment had to get unanimous consent to be brought forward for a vote. And because there were literally hundreds of amendments that different senators had put forward, it was impossible to reach unanimous consent for this, because other senators wanted amendments on different things that they had an interest in. So it all came to this very glorious moment that we all watched very closely between Bernie Sanders and Senator Shelby and Senator Toomey and Senator Sinema. And a lot of people were very disappointed to see what happened there. We were as well, but that was not a surprise. It was not likely that, an amendment was going to be put forward in that way. But what we did get So again, Senators Warner and Portman, so they made a promise to our community, and they had said, when this bill was put forward and everybody said, hey, we need to make sure these people are not included, they said, we agree further clarity is needed and we're going to help you get that. So amendments were put forward, they failed, but they delivered a colloquy. And so that is something that goes into the legislative history. It's part of the legislative record, and it will live with this bill. And again, it's directed the IRS to not include those actors when they go to write the guidance. So now we're over to the House. It would obviously be better to get that clarity in the legislative text because that's stronger than legislative history. But again, there is very significant political forces behind this bill, and there's significant constraints. On the House side, we're dealing with other dynamics. As Speaker Pelosi has put forward a set of rules, these were already passed by the House, and they've looped in 3 different pieces of legislation. It's the budget resolution, as well as the John Lewis Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2021, so completely outside of this, and then the BIF, the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And those were all put together in one set of rules, and they're all being considered together. So they're all looped in, and that was part of the design, again, to get this passed into law as soon as possible. And that rule states that this is going to be a closed process with no debate and no amendments. So I think all of us can criticize that because public policy making really should be done in an open and a transparent way. And why we wouldn't allow debate on something so important is, it's very questionable, but that is the current state. Mm-hmm. So they've also said that this bill, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, has to be considered by September 27th. Yeah. So later this month. Now, at this point, there is not a rules process that's going to allow for amendments. However, the House could vote on a new set of rules if they wanted to. If they get to the 27th and the House does not have the votes to pass this, they may change the rules. So this all could change. This is a fluid process. Everything could look very different in a couple of weeks from now, but at this point, there is not a process for amendments. Now, there may be an opportunity to get an amendment on the reconciliation bill. It's one of those 3 other bills that are being put forward. There's no indication at this point that that is possible, but it's a potential way of going about this. I can tell you what we're doing at the chamber is we are going through every single channel and avenue that to us to achieve additional clarifications on this law. We really don't want to see this interpreted in the wrong way. Again, at this point, there is no indication that it will be, but we are still fighting to make sure that is solidified in every single step of the way. So we've done that on the Senate side. We're working on that in the House side currently. We have a couple more weeks to finish that. And then we have about a year, once this gets passed into law, to work with the IRS on those guidelines, and that process is underway as well.
Okay. Well, like I said, for some came out of nowhere, for others was expected, but having this, very specific crypto language and policy attached to, this behemoth bill that has other political importance. I mean, the 2 things just seem not necessarily, a match made in heaven from a policy perspective. But I think what it does indicate, and a positive takeaway from my side would be that we do have senators and policymakers that understand the importance of this industry, so much so that they want to tax it. And then we have a whole cohort of members of the blockchain caucus that are, really advocating for the industry. And so whilst this is, critically important, I think there are some positives to take away from that, in the ongoing engagement with policymakers, and at least crypto is being discussed at these levels of government where previously it was not as significant. So I think there's pros and cons. I know that you have been quite vocal in the media and social media around the importance of preventing misinformation and really working with policymakers to ensure that they're educated and understand the benefits and the risks that crypto and blockchain technology does bring to the financial sector and other sectors. What do we do now? Now that we're at this level where crypto is being included as a pay-for in large infrastructure bills. How do we go forward as an industry to better advocate for ourselves? And how does the community support the efforts that organizations like the Chamber are undertaking?
So there's, I think the biggest tool going forward is education on both sides, quite frankly, on the industry side and with our public policymakers. One of the biggest constraints we had as this was going through the process in the Senate is that senators were being asked to weigh in and vote on amendments regarding cryptocurrencies and proof of work and proof of stake and mining. And a lot of them had absolutely no idea what this was about. So there was a very scary moment that we had on the Senate where we had these two competing amendments that were put forward. There are two groups of senators that came and asked for amendments. One of those amendments was not technology neutral. So it said proof of work miners would be excluded. And the danger of that is because it had this technology, this non-technology neutral language in it, it could imply that other types of miners or other types of consensus mechanisms would be included.
And do you think that was just because they didn't necessarily understand that language was very specific?
So I do have a lot of insights into what happened there. And what I can tell you is that I don't believe some of the people behind that understood that it was not technology neutral. This was all happening very, very, very quickly. Yeah. And again, a lot of this language, including the language in the amendments, did not have the opportunity to go through a proper process for the legal experts and the tax experts to be able to weigh in on it. Mm-hmm. So we started to see things come in a very expedited way. And at one point, there was an amendment that was put forward that was not technology neutral, which would have been devastating if it passed. And that amendment had the support of the White House and the Treasury behind it. So just think about that for a minute. So you have a bill out there, an amendment. It's very possible they were going to hold votes that night. Other things came in and votes didn't ultimately happen, thank goodness. But if votes would have gone forward, that amendment very well could have passed because senators were being asked to vote on something they didn't know. So think about being in the seat of just a Democratic senator. The White House has said, hey, we support that one. They're going to trust what the White House says. Why are they going to go against the president? And they don't understand it, nor do they have the time, nor do they have appropriate time to get a briefing or to get any type of background information so they can make an informed decision. They're just going to do what is recommended to them by leadership. Right. So we were in an incredibly dangerous position. So yes, a lot more education is needed. I think this process brings a lot of awareness on Capitol Hill, especially to a lot of the staff, because a lot of the staff was scrambling, trying to figure out what to do. So I think more people understand that we really do need to understand how this technology works in order to be able to do our jobs and execute efficiently and effectively on the Hill. I think that also goes for the crypto space. There's a lot of people who started weighing in on this provision. That's great. Again, there was a lot of people were very surprised by a lot of things. These things were not surprising to us at the Chamber. Like having a competing amendment put forward, that's an old trick. That's something, it's pretty normal to see things like that when you get into these political debates. Once you get onto the floor, people were caught by surprise by that. And then people were also very, very disappointed that it didn't get unanimous consent. It had like a 1% chance of passing unanimous consent, if that. And the fact that people were very upset and then started kind of retaliating in their own kind of way on social media just kind of shows that a lot of people in this space don't understand even just the basics of the political process. So in order for us to be effective in the way that we engage on Capitol Hill, we have to know how it works.
Right.
And procedure is some of the most basic things. So this is why the chamber is here. I'm a former congressional staffer. We have, a whole government affairs and public policy and advocacy team who are experts on this. Their whole job is just focused on the political process, on the public policy impacting cryptocurrencies. And we're here to help guide our members. We're here to help guide the industry on how to navigate these incredibly tricky situations. So I'm really proud of what we accomplished throughout this. We overcame some pretty significant feats. We're not done, but we were incredibly effective. And our message of you cannot include the miners, the node operators, the validators, that stuck. And everybody has recognized what we were pushing for. And we have very strong indicators that that part of the ecosystem is going to be protected throughout this entire process. So education, I do believe, continues to be our biggest tool. And we've got a lot of work to do on both sides.
Yeah, I think you raise a really important point around understanding how the political process works and understanding the procedural process. And I think one of the things that came across to me personally was that there were members of the community that especially if you are outside of the US, you don't necessarily understand what a payfor is, right? So how did this even end up in this bill and why? And I think in the beginning, it seemed like, maybe it was an attack on crypto, but I don't think it had anything at all to do with crypto. It had to do with trying to pay for everything else, roads, bridges, infrastructure, right? And maybe it was a bit of an easy target, but even then going through the amendment process, the amendment got shot down or the amendment didn't pass. But if you understand the process and you know that there's probably 30 other senators that have an amendment for could be anything, right? And they want their amendment considered. And so, it's just a matter of process to go, no, shoot that amendment down because it's not mine. If you're not going to hear mine, we're not going to hear that one. So none of these things are necessarily directed at crypto, but the idea that the industry could and will now be part of that political process, I think, raises the bar for the industry to be able to advocate for itself in a way that is part of the process and not necessarily, kind of in disalignment with the process or trying to do things kind of outside of the process. And I think that this shows us that that's just not going to be productive.
Yeah, productivity is something I talk a lot about with our members at the chamber. As someone who worked on the Hill previously, I can tell you I've seen a lot of lobbyists, a lot of government affairs people spin a lot of wheels on the Hill. Only 2%, I quote this stat a lot, only 2% of legislation that is introduced will become law. So understanding the political process is incredibly important because there's only a few things that are able to move through that process. Mm-hmm. And companies or organizations, individuals can spend a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of resources running around the Hill doing things that ultimately accomplish zero. So when at the chamber, when we engage and unleash our resources on the Hill, we want to be, the most responsible stewards of industry resources. We're funded by donations from the community. And it's really important that we use those effectively. So we're not just throwing resources out the window for the sake of running around the Hill. When we expend those resources, it's very targeted, it's very strategic, and it's because we know we can make a difference and have an impact on the conversation. I don't think everybody can say that today after what happened the past couple of weeks, because I do think there were a lot of people trying to get involved and they didn't really understand the process and they were getting tripped up. And I think led to a lot of the frustration. So again, it's really important if you're going to be in an active lobbying or advocacy role, you've got to understand the process, because one, you don't want to waste your time, but two, missteps can have huge impacts. And there were big missteps that were made. Those were demonstrated in the fact that 2 competing amendments were put forward. One that would have been incredibly devastating to the industry got support from the White House. It very well could have had the votes to pass. And we were just in a very dangerous and vulnerable situation. So it is important, if you want to be a part of that process, to know what you're doing. And if you don't know what you're doing, reach out to experts there's lots of organizations, there's lots of consultants who have an expertise in this. You got to make sure what you're doing is informed. Because consequences can, you can waste a lot of time and you can have critical missteps that can hurt other people.
Brilliant. So Perianne, what's next for crypto in the legislative space? How long do you think it will take to get some kind of resolution on this particular bill? And maybe I can just kind of, tap you for some information. What else should the industry be looking out for other than paying their taxes?
Right. Yeah. So this bill, the rules state has to be considered by the 27th. So by the end of the month, this, likely will go through the process on the House side, and will very likely be passed into law. And then the IRS has about a year to put forward the guidance. Again, that guidance is where all the details are. So for people who have a vested interest and what the outcome of information reporting provisions look like for digital assets, it's important to engage with the regulator. So we're doing that at the chamber. And so everyone is welcome to be a part of what we do at the chamber if you'd like to use our resources to engage there. Or people can do that individually, and some companies are opting to do that. In addition, you kind of said what are some other things? Well, the one thing that I would state for companies who clearly are brokers, the crypto exchanges, this is now on IRS's radar, and it's in the Green Book. So this is a priority of IRS. This is a priority of Treasury overall. This is a priority of the White House, and it's a priority of Senate Finance. So know that information reporting for digital assets is not a place that IRS has done any enforcement to date for our community, but it is going to come. So if you are not sure if you are subject to information reporting, now is the time to make sure you do know. And also, if you're not totally buttoned up in that area, now is the time to be proactive and make sure you are in compliance. This will be a focus, and for those who are not complying, you're now going to have a spotlight on you. So it's incredibly important that if you do not understand your tax obligations, you figure out what those are, talk with a tax lawyer, get it, and make sure you're buttoned up in that area.
Awesome. Great advice. Perianne, thank you so much for joining us and breaking this all down for us. It was really helpful and great to see you.
Thanks, Teana.
Take care.